The Honjo Masamune is the ultimate samurai sword. In Japan, it's regarded as a national treasure, a thing of beauty, shaped by fire, a thing of power, born of water. Forged centuries ago by master swordsmith Masamune.
If it's a Masamune, it's almost like having crown jewels.
Proven in battle for centuries. Legend tells of a just blade, discerning and honorable. It was venerated as the hereditary sword of power by the ruling shoguns. Passed from generation to generation for 700 years. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, it disappeared.
It is the vanished embodiment of Japanese tradition and an object of great desire.
Records tell us a mysterious US sergeant took it to be destroyed. But some say he saved it and took it home to America. Now worth millions of dollars, experts believe it may still be out there.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognized.
This is the story of the ancient legendary Honjo Masamune, lost sword of the samurai. In the late 13th century, the rulers of Kamakura province near Tokyo had a serious problem. The invading Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan. Under the onslaught, their weapons simply weren't up to the task.
When the Mongol invasion happened, Japanese swords were nice, slender, beautiful-looking things, but they broke on the Mongol armour.
To solve this problem, they turned to swordsmith Honjo Masamune. Masamune's task was to redesign the Japanese sword to withstand the armor and kill the Mongol invaders. Masamune developed techniques that have never been surpassed. First, Masamune beat red-hot high-carbon steel into a thick rectangular billet. Then cutting and folding it again and again, he forged a blade composed of over 30,000 layers. To the thick back edge and the thin cutting edge, he gave very different properties. And these were born not from the heat of the fire, but how the steel cooled in water.
The cutting edge, because it hardened quickly, is very, very hard, almost as hard as glass, but it's brittle.
The thicker, heavier back edge gave up its heat more slowly. This changed the structure of the iron itself, making it far less hard but more flexible than the vulnerable sharp edge.
The back, because it cools slowly, is tough and malleable, and it supports and stops that brittle edge cracking.
In battle, the thin edge was used defensively to cut. It is rigid and razor sharp, and the back used defensively as a shield. Its flexible spine absorbing impact. But to withstand the Mongol armor, Masamune also made his blades broader from edge to back for strength, the point longer to pierce, and the hardened edge deeper to aid repair. And so, Masamune brought the samurai sword to the peak of perfection, exemplified by the Honjo Masamune. Not just a weapon, but a work of art, an object of beauty. And Masamune's name still resonates throughout Japan today.
He's known to school children in Japan. They might know nothing else about Japanese swords, but his name is known.
Over the centuries, many legends have grown up about the great Masamune and the magical qualities of his swords. One of Masamune's pupils thought that after many years' training, he had surpassed his master. To test the quality of their respective blades, they suspended them in a stream. The student's blade was so sharp that it cut leaves and twigs, everything in its path. Masamune's blade, just as sharp, cut nothing. The student claimed victory, but a bystander disagreed. He observed that Masamune's blade did not cut needlessly. It was discerning and honorable, a just blade.
Masamune is generally given the titles Goro Nayudo, which have Buddhist implications, suggesting he was of the priesthood, or at least a devout follower of Buddha.
His finest work, the Honjo Masamune, was primarily a weapon for cutting human flesh. And the samurai would develop a very practical method for testing blades.
For a fee, an official tester would use a blade on a corpse from the execution grounds and report back to the owner on how it cut and how it behaved and how many bodies and which particular part of the body to cut.
The edge was sharp and the back strong, but yet another key property made the sword so deadly: its curve.
Swords were made curved because they cut flesh better when they're curved. There's a slicing action that's automatically built into the cut.
There are diagrams which show the various cuts that were tested.
Fantasy, myths, ancient beginnings. Elevate your historical exploration to unparalleled heights with a History Hits subscription. Don't miss out on our latest releases, where classicist Natalie Haynes travels to Corfu to unravel the story of the Gorgon Medusa, one of the most iconic yet misconstrued figures of Greek mythology. Join Jasmine Elmer as she dives into something that people have been obsessed with throughout history: dragons. Where did they come from? What exactly is a dragon? Finally, Dan Snow explores the ancient history of the Isles of Scilly and discovers burial grounds built thousands of years ago. Discover hundreds of hours of award-winning documentaries and ad-free podcasts with History Hit. Sign up for a special offer via the link in the description.
The easiest was to chop through a wrist or an ankle. The most difficult would be through the pelvic girdle or the shoulder girdle, and diagonally down through the rib cage, and cuts like that.
As a permanent record, the test results would be carved into the sword's tang under the mounted grip.
It shows that these swordsmiths had great concern, not only just for the look of their swords, but of the effectiveness of their swords.
History doesn't record precisely when Masamune drew from his furnace the greatest blade he ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Around the year 1300 is the closest anyone can say. Nothing is known of its early life or battles, who wore it proudly in his belt, or who inherited it over the centuries. Such a fine sword would have played an important part in the rigid social structure of feudal Japan, in which everyone knew their place.
At the top was the shogun, who was if you like, a military dictator. Below him would be various large landowners.
The powerful landowning lords, the daimyos, were protected by the knightly class, the samurai. The name literally means one who serves.
The soul of a samurai is to serve. The soul of a samurai is to wait. The soul of a samurai is to follow his lord, until such time as his lord may want him.
The sword was an essential part of a samurai's dress. the uniform of his class. The long sword was a large part of who he was.
The sword was something more than just a weapon. It was his most prized possession. It was described as the soul of the samurai.
The sword was an important thing for the samurai because it was their badge of rank. It was their status symbol, if you like.
Just as a samurai's life belonged to his lord, lives of those with a lower rank, farmers and peasants, belonged to him.
The samurai were allowed to cut down anybody without any excuse. If you insulted me and you were a peasant, I could just cut you down and that was it.
The Honjo Masamune first enters recorded history when, 300 years after it was made, it got its name. In the 16th century, in battle, General Honjo Shigenaga was attacked by an enemy with Masamune's masterpiece. The sword had already claimed a number of trophy heads that day, but General Honjo Shigenaga prevailed, and finally victorious took the sword as his prize. From then on, it bears his name, Honjo Masamune. Soon afterwards, General Shigenaga was ordered to Fushimi Castle. But short of money, he sold the now priceless sword for 13 large gold coins. At today's gold prices, around £2,500. It was now that the Honjo Masamune was transformed from a valued weapon to priceless symbol of absolute power. The superlative sword became the ultimate gift to pass up the social ladder to nobles of ascending rank as a token of esteem. Eventually, it was received in tribute by warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu. With the Honjo Masamune at his side, Tokugawa Ieyasu was about to change the course of Japanese history. Japan was being torn apart by civil war. Daimyo against daimyo, samurai against samurai, each fighting loyally for his lord to the death. Finally, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu amassed enough military power to seize overall control. He made the emperor a mere figurehead. Ieyasu himself would rule all Japan as military dictator. He would be the shogun.
Japan was at war for 150 years between the 15th and the 16th centuries. And the great Tokugawa achievement is to make peace break out, if you like.
The Tokugawa shoguns brought 250 years of peace to Japan. And their ceremonial sword was the Honjo Masamune. Over the centuries, the hereditary sword of the shoguns was passed from generation to generation. Even after the Tokugawas fell from power in 1868, the great sword continued to be handed down within the aristocratic family into the 20th century. In 1939 in Tokyo, it was designated a Japanese national treasure, a survivor of 700 years of turbulent history. It was only in the upheaval of the Second World War that the mystery of the Honjo Masamune begins, when it disappeared. Japan entered World War II in 1941 with a surprise attack on the US Navy anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. As Japan poured millions of troops into battle, the High Command boosted recruitment and morale by fostering the ideals of Japan's ancient past, Bushido, the way of the warrior, and the heroic exploits of the samurai. So they gave out swords.
If you were recruiting people from backgrounds which had no military history whatsoever, the simple act of recruiting them, giving them a sword, or allowing them to wear a sword and carry a sword was, in a way, elevating them in status and giving them a pride.
Every officer, sergeant, and corporal had to wear a sword as part of his uniform. The sheer number required was huge. So these modern military swords were not hand-beaten by master craftsmen in the traditional way.
A lot of swords made for officer class were mass-produced from pieces of steel, usually a piece of railway line. A lot were made in factories. All of the swords made for NCOs were mass-produced in factories from ordinary steel.
By the Second World War, there are estimated to have been as many as 2 million swords worn by the Japanese military. The symbolism of the sword continued to be promoted in Japanese propaganda throughout World War II. This pilot on the cover of Japanese propaganda magazine Front in 1943 carries his sword center frame as a symbol of honor, justice, and fighting spirit.
It's a very well-informed, very well-composed, highly artistic, and very effective image. But it's not true. This is not how pilots got into planes. This is staged. But samurai myths about sacrifice become very useful for steeling yourself before you are going to get into the cockpit of a plane in which you are probably going to die.
For the Japanese, war was a fight to the death. The emperor and the government could not countenance surrender. On August the 6th and 9th, 1945, American B-29 aircraft dropped a nuclear bomb on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just 6 days later, the Japanese had to bear the unbearable, think the unthinkable. They surrendered.
Across the radio comes the voice of the emperor, which nobody's heard before. And it's a very strange voice, it's a very high voice, it's a very weak voice. He's talking in a language that most of them don't understand. But the message is clear. We've lost.
At the end of the Second World War, the average Japanese person would have been totally devastated by having suffered defeat, a loss of face. But on the other hand, the war was over, and the hardship they'd been through, the firebombing, the starvation, was finished.
Not for the first time in Japanese history, the emperor had to move aside for a powerful shogun. Shogun is a very old title in Japanese history. It means not just military commander, but supreme dictator. And the man the United States sent to rule occupied Japan was certainly that. 5-star General Douglas MacArthur.
You get this tall, white American stepping out of an aeroplane in a very theatrical way. He's dressed very particularly, his collar is open, and this is the new guy in town. MacArthur was a dictator, and he was the supreme commander. It's a time of chaos, and MacArthur's there to do a very particular job, and he's very aware of the job he's going to do. He's very charismatic, he's very savvy. There's a very famous photograph, for example, of MacArthur standing next to the emperor in morning coat, looking incredibly formal. MacArthur again with the open shirt collar and towering over him. And of course it's a way of making a very profound statement.
MacArthur officially accepted the Japanese surrender in a ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
As soon as the surrender was signed, MacArthur, as Supreme Commander Allied Powers, set to work. He issued SCAP General Order No. 1, the immediate surrender of all Japanese armed forces. MacArthur demanded they cease hostilities and lay down their arms.
At the beginning of the occupation, though, there are two main objectives. The first, the urgent one, is demilitarization. You have to take the stuff away, you have to make sure they don't do it again.
MacArthur's plan was to make sure Japan could never wage war again. Total demilitarization and disarmament were paramount.
They destroyed a lot of, honest-to-God, modern military material, planes and so on and so forth. They also collected a lot of gunpowder, which of course has its uses. They just collected everything.
MacArthur soon destroyed hundreds of ships and thousands of planes. But what should he do with all those swords? Every Japanese officer, sergeant and corporal carried one at his side. There were millions of them, but MacArthur was determined to collect every one. Not because the swords were a military threat, but because of their enduring symbolic importance.
Certainly, taking away weapons is one way of demonstrating your authority. And of course, the sword is not, in the end, a weapon. It's a symbolic statement about authority. It's the thing that somebody would carry who was in charge. So to take the symbol of authority away is important.
All over the Pacific, surrender ceremonies were organized by the victorious Allies. On parade grounds in Sumatra, Burma, and Malaya, Japanese fighting men suffered the humiliation of surrendering their treasured swords to the Americans.
Your government, regarding military swords as weapons, does not acknowledge the wearing of swords as dress, and we have been ordered to surrender all kinds of swords. Japanese officers are extremely dejected and troubled.
What the Allies didn't realize was that some of the swords were not modern, mass-produced weapons, but handcrafted antiques of great value.
Some families at the beginning of the war who did own swords that had been in the family for many, many generations and possibly had been used in warfare in the distant past, took them to battle, having picked up a tradition that had been going on for centuries of carrying an ancestor's sword into battle.
Surrendering a venerable family heirloom was especially painful.
I cannot help heaving a deep sigh of sorrow in parting with my most beloved sword, my spirit, with which my ancestors went to war, and which my father himself handed over to me when I set out from home for this war, praying for my heroic victory in every action.
Hundreds of thousands of swords were surrendered, but what to do with them? Some were awarded to Allied officers or to civilians who had distinguished themselves in the war effort. To one, a crude, mass-produced blade, to another, perhaps a centuries-old work of art. The Americans didn't know or care. But most of the swords were not given away. They were destroyed. The SCAP instruction for disarmament applied not only to frontline soldiers, but the people of Japan at home too. Even swords in private hands. The Honjo Masamune in the Tokugawa mansion in Tokyo was no exception.
Collect and deliver all arms in the possession of the Japanese civilian population.
All of the swords in Japan were rounded up into centres, usually warehouses or school gymnasiums, and piled high ready for destruction.
The order to collect all swords meant just that. These seizures were indiscriminate. Family heirlooms decorating homes and masterpieces in collections were commandeered as quickly as military blades.
The people who were handling the swords, who were sweeping them up in the dragnet, were quite low-level functionaries, very hard-pressed for time, as low-level functionaries normally are. They're not colonels with an enormous amount of time on their hand. They don't know what they're dealing with.
The owners of swords were instructed to take them to collection points such as police stations. Even the aristocratic Tokugawa family, who as shoguns once ruled Japan, were not exempt. The SCAP instructions were law, and they were ordered to relinquish all their fine swords, including the legendary Honjo Masamune. In Japan, there was outrage. Would they really have to give it up to the Americans, who appreciated nothing of its history or symbolism? Influential people, collectors and museum curators, were soon complaining to SCAP about this assault on the Japanese heritage.
Very quickly they discover that there's blowback, if you like, that they are being indiscriminate and that they're annoying some people. Of course, they learn more very quickly. They learn that some people don't like having their swords taken away. They learn that there are collectors of Japanese swords who have nice collections, which got caught up in the dragnet.
A key figure in trying to save swords, like the Honjo Masamune, was Dr. Junji Homma of the Tokyo Museum. He met military police commander Colonel Victor C. Cadwell of the US 8th Army, the officer in charge of weapons collection. Dr. Homma explained that some swords were ancient works of an almost forgotten art, like the cathedrals of the West. A vivid symbol that was an extension of the samurai himself, influencing Japanese art and literature. Dr. Homma argued that they were not military weapons at all. Treasures like the Honjo Masamune were art swords.
It was people like Homma who coined the phrase of Japanese art swords in order to save them from destruction by the occupying forces.
It was essential they were preserved because they were part of Japan's historic artistic inheritance. Then this term art sword was devised.
Homma succeeded and convinced Colonel Cadwell that Japanese swords were not simply wartime weapons and should no longer be treated as such. SCAP Instruction 12 tried to clarify the situation.
You are advised that if these swords are the personal property of those officers concerned, they may be retained on condition that henceforth it will be understood that they have no military significance whatsoever, but are household treasures.
But Cadwell didn't have the final word. As late as November the 11th, 1945, contradictory orders were issued by SCAP.
All swords, including privately owned swords, shall be treated as symbols of militarism and destroyed.
As a result, valuable antique blades continued to be swept up.
Sadly, a lot of very fine traditional swords did go into the melting pot.
Some families protected their heirlooms by deceiving the Americans.
Certain families in Japan deliberately acquired what I can only describe as very poor quality swords and hid their better swords because they knew they were going to be taken by the victors.
But the Tokugawa family did no such thing. They took a very different, honourable course and accepted the latest edict from SCAP. Just before Christmas 1945, the last known owner of the Honjo Masamune, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a descendant of the shoguns, obeyed the law and delivered the family's swords to Majiro police station.
The family still does have ownership of it, and so they can do something useful, which is their duty. Because, of course, the symbolic value of the old military family of Japan, the first military family of Japan, giving up the symbol of their authority to the new occupiers in order that Japan can embark on a new path.
Tokugawa Ieyasu handed in 15 swords, bundled all together. And among them was the finest sword ever made, the Honjo Masamune. Mr. Tokugawa never saw the great family sword again. The Honjo Masamune disappeared and entered the realm of conjecture and mystery. The first clue to what became of the lost sword of the samurai appeared in New York 20 years after the end of World War II. The August 1966 edition of Saga, an American adventure and mystery magazine, contained an article listing Japanese national treasures that went missing after the war. The list of 14 swords included the Honjo Masamune. Here in black and white, it recorded that a Sergeant Coldy Bymore of the 7th US Cavalry had collected it from the police station at Majiro. But how reliable was this record? What is undoubtedly true is that the 7th Cavalry patrols were in Tokyo and did make inventories of all arsenals, factories, barracks, and storage depots. They also disposed of munitions and conducted patrols in search of hidden Japanese weapons, including swords. This corroborates the Saga magazine article. The next question is, did Sergeant Coldy Bymore take the sword from the police station? Unfortunately, all police records for the period in question are lost. But there is another source, the Japanese Department of Education. Their records at the time make it clear that the Honjo Masamune certainly was taken from Majiro police station by Sergeant Bymore. But where did he take it? All over Japan, collected swords were piled high in warehouses before being dumped at sea or melted down for scrap iron. In Tokyo, for Sergeant Coldy Bymore, storage was at the Akabane depot. To avoid the destruction of art swords, every blade at Akabane was scrutinized by Dr. Junji Homa's inspection committee. It was a big success. Nearly 5,000 swords were identified as important cultural artifacts and returned to their owners. But the Honjo Masamune was not among them. Was it fed to the furnace and destroyed? Or did Coldy Bymore keep it for himself?
I think it's most unlikely that the Honjo Masamune sword did go into a melting pot. The Tokugawa, having been shoguns of Japan, and hence at the pinnacle of Japanese society, would have had some extremely fine swords, and I'm pretty sure that even the police in the local police station and the sergeant to which they were handed over to would have recognised the quality of the mountings, if nothing else. And therefore, I suspect they were shipped back to America pretty quickly.
What is certainly true is that the American Army operated an official war trophy system. A GI who had taken part in the Pacific War could, with the correct permission slip, take home one enemy gun and one sword as personal souvenirs. Most of these returning men were carrying mass-produced military swords, nothing special. But some GIs unknowingly had centuries-old works of art of great cultural and monetary value. It's very possible that the Honjo Masamune was taken by Coldy Bymore as his personal memento. If this was true, the question then became, when did Sergeant Bymore get shipped home? And did he carry the Honjo Masamune with him? At this point, the trail becomes even more obscured. 7th Cavalry records should reveal when Sergeant Coldy Bymore left Japan and when he arrived home. But the 7th Cavalry Veterans Association lists no one by that name. Does that mean there never was a Coldy Bymore? The facts are more complicated. The Saga magazine article contains another clue. It describes the name Coldy Bymore as phonetic. This indicates it's a translation from English into Japanese. The strange name Coldy Bymore may be inaccurate.
We're moving between languages. We're moving between languages fast on a busy day when there are 100 different things to do by somebody scribbling in a book. So when you hear the name that's come down to us, the first thing that comes to mind is, this isn't an American name. This is a problem of transliteration.
The Japanese have developed phonetic alphabets to help transcode English and other languages. The characters are not words, as in Japanese, but represent particular sounds. It is not precise.
In order to get the sergeant's name down, what the Japanese sergeant would have done would have been to write his name in a Japanese syllabary, an alphabet, but we call it a syllabary, because it's a way of transliterating English into Japanese.
This system of transliteration is far from perfect, as Japanese sounds don't appear in English, and English sounds have no Japanese equivalent. The name may not be Coldy Bymore, but something that sounds a bit like it.
If you think back to that moment when he wrote it down, it sounds something like Goru di Baimor, or maybe Bimoru, and actually then transcribing back, because it went both ways. So maybe this is Goldie Beamer, maybe this is Cody, maybe this is Biltmore. God knows. When the American sergeant said, "Oh, my name's Goldie Beamer," the Japanese would say Goru di Bimaru, and then put it into these characters which then come back to us in a scrambled form.
So was there a 7th Cavalry Sergeant in Tokyo on the 18th of January 1946 with a name similar to Coldy Bymore? Unfortunately, the scrap records of lowly sergeants have been routinely destroyed. The true name of the sergeant can never be found. But even so, many believe the Honjo Masamune could still turn up. In the years since the war, Americans began to understand the prestige and value of fine Japanese swords properly. President Truman was given a 650-year-old sword in a 350-year-old silk wrapping as a war souvenir. The Allied occupation of Japan continued until 1952, and the influx of swords to America after the Second World War was like a tsunami. For the handful of knowledgeable sword enthusiasts who recognized the characteristics which made a blade great, there was the opportunity to make a lot of money.
I could quite easily buy swords one day for £15 and sell them the next day for £300 or something, which was incredible sort of stuff.
Dealers discovered that hidden in the stream of confiscated weapons, there were historically important swords now scattered all over the US.
In America has still got thousands of swords stashed away in attics, box rooms, garages, which was brought back as trophies and are merely regarded as, oh, Grandad's old sword.
Could the Honjo Masamune be among Grandad's old swords? Since World War II, there have been thousands of ads placed in newspapers all over the US offering to buy Japanese swords. These were the days when a fine collection could still be acquired very cheaply.
In America, especially over the 1970s and 80s, I've heard it termed as the gold rush over there, and people were making fortunes buying, selling swords, and mostly selling them back to Japan.
As this market developed, some important art swords did occasionally turn up. Avid collector Clive Sinclair came by a sword when it surfaced in just this way. Wonderfully preserved, it was made especially for the shogun's chief test cutter.
It turned up in an antique fair, swapped hands for £400. Within half an hour, it's got up to £1,500. And I paid £10,000 for it. And I've spent another £3,000 on it since then. And it's been exhibited in Japan. It's a very good sword.
Could this one day happen to the Honjo Masamune? If it did emerge from someone's attic, how could it be recognized? There is a telltale way of knowing. 700 years ago, when Masamune plunged the hot blade into cold water, he gave birth to a razor-sharp weapon. But he also gave the Honjo Masamune a unique signature.
If a sword turned up that was claimed to be the Honjo Masamune, because it was a national treasure, prior to the war there were very, very accurate drawings made of its shape, the patterning of the hardened edge, which you could use to compare a sword with, to say, yes, it's the same, or no, it isn't.
For centuries, it was customary for an artist to meticulously draw the unique pattern on the edge of a fine sword, the hamon. When in 1939 the Japanese declared the Honjo Masamune a national treasure, such fine detailed drawings of the hamon were made. If the Honjo Masamune ever appeared at an antiques fair or auction, there could be no mistake. Its fingerprints have been taken.
At this point, perhaps the best way of understanding the meaning of that sword is as an artistic object. So it's made by a famous maker, and it has fabulous provenance. If you go to an auction house today, you need something with provenance. You need to know which hands it's passed through.
But any lucky finder in the US would face a catch-22. For a collector to be certain, for its identity to be official, the Honjo Masamune would have to be sent to Japan for shinsa, a rigorous examination by Japanese experts.
The problem with that is, if you live in America and you own this sword and you send it to Japan for shinsa, they won't allow it to export be exported again. So you've actually got to give it back to Japan, basically, to get it verified.
So, if anyone did find it, they would have every incentive to keep it secret, for fear of losing it. Whatever the case, the whereabouts of the Honjo Masamune remains a complete mystery to this day. Anyone trying to trace it faces huge obstacles. The few clues there are sparse. The identity of the elusive cavalry sergeant is still a mystery. Precisely what happened that day at the Majiro police station may never be known. If only we had the paperwork, a signature, the Honjo Masamune might yet be found. It's one of the ironies of this story that the Honjo Masamune needn't have been handed in at all. If the Tokugawas had only waited just a few months until the law was changed, they could have kept it.
Maybe even 6 months later, it would have been protected. It would still be there. It would probably be somewhere deep in a vault in the Tokyo National Museum. The Honjo Masamune would have become, again, firmly, finally, a national treasure, a national property put on show for the people of the new nation, not as a weapon, as a work of art.
There is another irony. Because it is lost, the Honjo Masamune has been transformed from a historical artifact to a thing of legend.
Maybe the most important fact about this sword is that it's lost. A thing that no longer is there, or a thing that you've never seen, is much more powerful than one that you have close at hand.
The legend will only ever grow stronger until more evidence can establish where it is or whether it has been destroyed.
Unless we see its corpse or something, we'll never know, will we? I mean, unless we see its broken tang or something, we'll never know.
Anyone with a love of Japanese swords can never give up hope.
I still somehow feel that it still does exist, possibly unrecognised, somewhere.
Things usually turn up when somebody dies and heirs go in and discover objects. It could still turn up. If it did, it would be a media spectacle.
It would be wonderful if somebody could find that sword.
While a treasure such as the Honjo Masamune remains lost, stories will be told of its possible location, and people will dream of it, hunt for it. The lost sword of the samurai.